I'm going to get into the backstory of Flutter and just make sure everyone knows what Flutter is all about, where it came from, why Flutter even exists in the first place. And then from that point on, I'll give a quick intro to how to build a Flutter app. And we'll see, by the time this talk's over, you'll know how to build a Flutter app. And then the next talk, you'll know how to build it even better. So let's get started. Who am I? I'm a Google developer expert for Flutter. And then I'm also the CTO of ML and Cloud at Bitstrap, where we kind of do like ML Cloud applications. And I have a startup called Irene. What's interesting is I do very little Flutter in my professional day. I do a lot of Flutter in my startup days. So as I'm working full-time on stuff, I also have a lot of small projects, startups. Some are pretty successful, some aren't. But I use Flutter for anything mobile related. And the story, of how I got started into Flutter is very interesting. A while ago, probably 2014, I discovered a language called Dart. I think it was 2013 actually. And I've been developing for a long, long time. And I was doing Cold Fusion development before. And before that, I was doing like Flex, Adobe Flex. I don't know who remembers all this. And so as I got started into Android development when Android had just come out, I started my first startup. And one of the limitations I found was just a state of I was using JavaScript a lot, I was using Java a lot, I was using Node.js a lot, and I just wanted something better to learn. Because whenever I start something new, I always try to pick up a new language. And I ran across this language called Dart. And I like Dart a lot. And what Dart is essentially, in a very high level way, it's a very simpler version of, say, something like Java in terms of syntax, right? It's a very easy to use language. I might almost say it's very boring because you already know Dart. If you've ever done Java development, JavaScript development, C#, you already know Dart. And that's one of the beauty and powerful nature of Dart. You just know it. Because you look at the syntax, you're like, oh yeah, I know exactly how to do an if statement, for loop. So as long as you understand programming language principles, as long as you understand how to build an application, you already know Dart and you can get started. And so I started using Dart a lot. And I started giving talks on Dart. So flash forward to, this was, I believe, Munich. I was in Munich or San Francisco for a Flutter conference, for a Dart conference actually, and someone got on stage, and there was a special slot in the schedule that said they're going to be talking about Sky. And I was really curious to know what Sky was. And I thought, coming from an Android background, I thought Sky was, Google's getting rid of Java and they're going to be putting Dart inside of Java. And I got very excited and I was like, wow, this is amazing. The future is now. But the product manager of Chrome got on stage and my heart kind of sank. And I was like, oh no, are they kind of doing a weird web, something like Adobe Cordova, where you kind of build a web app and it gets wrapped up in a web view. And I really didn't like that because a lot of us, almost everyone, if you've been doing development for the past 10 years plus, you've been burned by cross-platform technologies. And that's really because back in the old days, which is like 6 years ago, 5 years ago, browsers weren't powerful. And so when you built these cross-platform language apps using HTML5, the browser just couldn't handle it. The mobile device couldn't handle it, right? And it became a crappy experience, really. So I thought that's where Dart was headed. But it was kind of a very interesting proposal that the Dart team was making. And the idea was, let's look at something like Unity, right? And if you look at Unity, if you've ever played Unity before, if you've played games before, developers, when they make games, they don't write a game for iOS, they don't write a game for Android. Some might do it, but most game developers use what's Unity. And Unity is a rendering engine that you can write code for, And as long as that rendering engine exists on that device, your code will run. So Unity exists for Xbox, PlayStation. It runs for Android, iOS. Works on your refrigerator if it has a TV. And so Google really thought about the same idea. And Google said, why don't we kind of copy Unity for apps? And that's really what Flutter is, right? If you think about it, if you've been doing development for more than 10 years, you might also know about a framework called Flash. And what Flutter is Flash done correctly, right? So Flash, the problems with Flash was it was a closed source, it was a plugin you need to install, it was all sorts of weird stuff with it. But conceptually, it's the same idea. You write code once, and as long as the rendering engine exists on this device, your code will run fine. And so Google had this problem internally, and Google has a lot of apps, right? Just think about all the apps that Google has, all the apps that Google kills, but then all the apps that they have internally, right? And Google wants to move fast. So their problem was, how do we build apps faster in a more streamlined way? And so that's really where Flutter comes from. There's this problem that they had where, listen, we keep building two versions of the same app. How do we make it better? And so internally, what they did, I assume this, is they made a big Google spreadsheet and they said, okay, we've decided that we want to build some sort of Unity or Flash conceptually a way of building apps. So what language should we use? And so they made a Google spreadsheet and they went around team to team. They asked them, hey guys, what language are you using at Google? And they found this team. It was a very small team, almost no one knows about it, called Google Ads. And Google Ads, which makes zero money for Google, was using a language called Dart. And they asked the Google Ads team, why are you using Dart? Right? And the Google Ads team said, well, we've used a lot of different languages in the past. And one of the things we like about Dart is so simple to learn. And the way the framework is designed, the way the language is designed, it's very easy to build applications. And we produce less bugs. Now, this is Google, right? They're tracking everything you're doing when they're working. Imagine the developer's ID. They're tracking time. They're tracking how much code how much bugs they're producing. And so they found that when they use Dart, bugs go down. They write code faster. Productivity increases. And it's just a fun language. And so this cross-platform team called Sky decided, let's use Dart. And so they took Dart and they took the idea of, cool, let's basically meld this with this concept we have of Unity for apps or Flash for apps, and let's stick it together. And that's really where Flutter comes from, right? And so they decided on a couple principles. They said, we have to make sure that this runs on 60 frames per second. And what that means is when the rendering engine is just rendering content on your Android or iOS or web or desktop, it needs to run at 60 frames per second. That means your code is going to run at 60 frames per second. It's not a web view, right? While it might sound like a web view where your application is running everywhere, it's not a web view at all. Right? And what's interesting is that they said, we're going to make this fast, beautiful, and natural. So before that, there was a comment in the chat right now that I just read about why is Flutter better than React Native. I will get to that in a couple of slides. So going back to it, Flutter being fast, beautiful, natural. Fast is 60 frames per second. Beautiful, while it's subjective, Google said, you know what? Why don't we take a look at a design language that we've invented called material design, right? These guidelines. And why don't we implement that first party, right? So literally, I don't know how many people know this, the material design team and the Flutter team sat beside each other for at least a year or two, making sure that Flutter components are one-to-one spec of the material design. Like if you use a Flutter app, that is the ultimate material design experience that you're getting. That's because the material design team basically sat there telling the developers, can you move this by 1 pixel to make sure that this works? And they enjoyed it because Flutter lets you customize everything so well that the material design team prioritizes Flutter now over Android and iOS when they're testing, prototyping, and even developing concepts for material design. Lastly, natural. Now, natural is probably the most important one. Fast is great. Fast obviously needs to be there. Beautiful. If you get a designer, you can design a nice app, right? But natural, I think, is one of the most key fundamental points of Flutter that I love. If your app is running on Android, it's going to behave and feel like an Android app. If your app is running on iOS, it's going to behave and feel like an iOS app. And that's because of the rendering engine. When Flutter runs on iOS and Flutter runs on Android, it changes the physics of your app. And so you automatically get a full native experience. So your user, as they're using your app, knows that, hey, this is an iOS app that I'm using, right? How many times have you downloaded a web app or a cross-platform app and felt, you know what, this doesn't feel like an iOS app, or this doesn't feel like an Android app, right? On Android, when you fling a list view, it doesn't bounce, right? It basically stops halfway through. Oh, 1 second. It basically stops halfway through, and then there's a blue glow. Versus on iOS, it kind of does this like list view, list view jump around, right? So with both, 1 second, I'm just getting a chat here. Oh, okay. Never mind. So I got distracted. Sorry. So what Flutter does is it makes sure that your components and everything behave exactly like how they're supposed to on the respective device. So I'm going to switch over to my IntelliJ, and I'm going to show a demo about how to run a simple Flutter app, right? So when you're building a Flutter app, you can build it in VS Code. You can build it in IntelliJ. You can build it in Vim if you want. I have a friend that uses Vim to write Flutter apps. It doesn't matter. You just go to flutter.dev and download the plugin of your choice. You can even write it in Notepad, right? As long as you use the Flutter compiler and it'll run it. So I'm going to open up IntelliJ here. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project. So I use IntelliJ. You can use whatever you want. VS Code, again, Vim, Flutter. I like IntelliJ just because I've been doing Android for so many years. I'm just used to the IDE. So I'm going to click File, New Flutter Project after I've installed the plugin, obviously. And it's going to ask me a couple questions, right? It's going to say, what's the project name? What's the description of the project? Organization, Android and iOS. Now, you might say, well, Faisal, you told me that Flutter uses Dart. So why is Flutter asking me about Android and iOS, right? And the reason why Flutter is asking you is Flutter doesn't come with every single integration with Android and iOS possible, right? That is not Flutter's job. Flutter comes with most things that you need. But what if tomorrow Samsung comes out and launches a nose sensor, right? Where you authenticate yourself by taking your nose and sticking it on your face, sticking it on your phone, right? Flutter's not going to build a plugin for that. Flutter's going to say, you know what, Faisal, you go write that plugin. And so when you write that plugin, you would write it in Swift or Objective-C, or actually Samsung, so you write it in Java or Kotlin. And if tomorrow iOS comes out with something that's very specific to like one device, then you will write a plugin on Objective-C or Swift. This way, you still get the entire power of these respective platforms, and you can still use Flutter, right? And I'll talk more about migration strategies of your existing apps in a bit. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say, all right, project name, Flutter Week, and organization is just going to be com.Flutter Week. Doesn't matter, right? Or all organization is just package name if you've done Android development, or organization ID if you've done iOS, right? So and when I click finish, and this is one of the beauty about Flutter, it's not magical, right? And what I mean by that is it's not doing something that's very very shady or hidden. It's tying into Gradle and it's tying into Xcode build, right? So you're getting the same tool chain. It's just that Flutter is just this additional thing in front of the tool chain, right? So as you write Dart code, Flutter will do something with it, the SDK, and then it will just pass it to Gradle, and it will pass it to Xcode build. And so if there's changes in Xcode build and Gradle, Flutter will still work, right? It's not doing anything magical where like Android's suddenly going to say, sorry, we can't allow Flutter anymore, or iOS says we can't allow Flutter anymore. It's the same tool chain. So here, my app has been created. And if you go down, if you see here, there's two folders here. There's an Android folder and an iOS folder, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually change my screen resolution just so it's easy for everyone to see. All right, this might be a bit better. All right, cool. So there's an Android and there's an iOS folder here, right? And so, like I said, it's gone ahead and it's created Gradle. It's created a Gradle build. It's created an iOS project. So I can actually go ahead and open up these projects in Android Studio and Xcode and be able to modify them, right? And most of the time you will have to do this when you're actually getting ready to deploy your application, because iOS requires you to like set up a signing certificate. Android might require you to like play with the package name or something if you've already used this package name before. So what's great is you just open this up in Android Studio or Xcode, everything works, right? So aside from that, once I have this, what I can do is I can actually run this application. I'm going to run it on the iOS simulator, and I'm going to run this on a simulator only because I just have it open right now. I can run this on an Android device. I can run this on an Android simulator. I can plug in my iPad if I wanted to and deploy it there. It doesn't matter, right? So I'm going to hit this, and I'm going to hit play. And so what it's doing now is it's going to open up it's going to open up my simulator, which it did. My simulator is massive right now. And it's going to run Xcode build. So if you see at the bottom left, it's actually running Xcode build. And like I said before, it's going through the same tool chain. So, tomorrow Apple comes out with a better version of Xcode, it's just going to be able to build it fine. You're not going to run into any issues. Right? Oh, you might run into one or two issues if there's like some like depth breaking change. Most of the time you won't. So now here's an issue because I turned down my screen resolution. My device is too big now, so I'm gonna just run it on a smaller device. Okay, so I'm gonna show you guys something very interesting. So that device was way too big. My resolution is screwing up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop running it, and I'm going to run it again on this new emulator that's launching up. So while that launches up, okay, cool. So I'm going to do is I'm going to call build again. And there were some issues with my screen share, so I'm just going to explain the same thing again. I'm running Xcode build. I'm running play on IntelliJ, which is causing Xcode build to run. Flutter is now passed over the code to Xcode build, and Xcode build will do what it does, right? It's going to go in and it's going to like compile my application, everything, and then it's going to push it to iOS. Sorry, technical difficulties. Yeah, I know someone said you can still resize it. I don't know why I couldn't resize my simulator. Okay, cool. So now that my application has been deployed, let's see some of the magical things that Flutter offers, right? So here, it's a very simple application. All I have to do is press this button, and it increments the count by 1. That's cool. You might say, wow, Faisal, such a compelling application, right? And you know what? It's boring. I agree. Now, let's take a look at how we can make it more interesting. So I'm going to make my windows so that you can see both applications. Cool. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into main.dart. And main.dart is where my Flutter application lives. It's what gets executed. These are small details, right? So your designer comes up to you and your designer says, Faisal, our app colors aren't blue. I don't know why you made our entire app blue. Can you please change it to red? So if this was Xcode or if this was iOS or Android development, you'd be like, okay, fine. I'm going to go into colors.xml, change the color, wait till the entire application builds, let it deploy, and the whole process ends up taking like, like 5 minutes, right? Especially if you have a slow machine. Here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit colors.red and save. And what you'll see is automatically my application has been updated to red. This is one of the most powerful features about Flutter. What it is hot reload. So if you've come from web development, this might seem, well, this is obvious. I just refresh my page, right? Or I have some sort of like web runner to auto refresh it. That's exactly what Flutter is doing. As you write code, it is pushing up your code changes in real time to the device natively, right? So this is very powerful. You can make development really quick. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename Flutter Demo, where it says Flutter Demo, to say Flutter Week, right? Flutter Week. And so now I've changed my color, I've changed Flutter Week. There's something that you might have noticed. Number 31 has stayed the same. And this is another really powerful thing. Flutter will always maintain state changes. Flutter will not get rid of your number, right? Like the variables, unless like it crashes or you change screens or something. But during a hot reload, your state always stays persistent. So this is very important when you're building very large applications and you want to hold on to a certain state, right? For example, if you're doing OAuth development and like 3 levels deep, you make a wrong API call and you pass in the wrong token, you don't want to restart that whole flow. With Flutter, you can just go in, change the variable name, just save the file actually, and it'll automatically cause it, change the variable. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to change the implementation here. Instead of it being counter plus plus, I'm going to go counter is equal to counter times 5. I'm going to hit save, right? That's all I'm doing, right? Nothing exciting. Now I'm going to press play. You'll notice that my application hasn't changed at all. Now when I press plus, my application's incrementing by times 5. I can be like, whoops, that was a mistake. It should be actually plus 2. I'm going to save that, go back, and now it's going up by plus 2. I can even start adding UI components. So I'm going to move my screen here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a text widget here. And I'm going to say text, hello Flutter Week, right? Save it. Now it says hello Flutter Week. I'm going to basically add a style to it. I'm going to make the fonts really big. Text style, font size, I'm going to say 30. Save it. Hello Flutter Week, right? So within 30 seconds, I've added a new component. I've styled it a bit. And so as you're developing applications, this becomes very powerful. You'll see if you spend a day building an application that guaranteed you will write more UI code. And you will be further along than you were if you're doing Android or iOS development, simply because how fast it is to develop. Now, let me show you something very interesting. A while ago, 2 years ago, I think, or 3 years ago, a friend of mine asked on Stack Overflow, how do I build, what is the alternative of a relative layout in Flutter? He comes from Android development, and he had built an iOS app, and he was porting his iOS app back to Android. So I told him, Tofik, don't bother with going back to Android. Why don't you just build a Flutter app, right? And so he knew how to do it in Android and iOS, but he wanted to know how to do it in Flutter. So he asked a simple question. He said, how do I do this in things? So he got relative layout in Flutter, right? And he said, hi, is there a way to do this? And he pasted this code. And this was his iOS app. And he said, can someone show me how to do this? And the Flutter team, being super helpful, went out of their way, because this was a really good question, and Colin Jackson of the Flutter team actually went ahead and wrote the code for that screen. Now, what's interesting is I can take this code, I can take this code here, and I can copy it, right? Then I can go back to my IDE, and I can paste it here. And I'm missing a colon here. Oh, I'm missing some lines. Perfect, right? And so now I'm about to hit save. Keep in mind, I just copied and pasted code from Stack Overflow. I'm going to hit save. And what you'll see is the entire application has changed. And this isn't a screenshot. This is an actual fully working application. Look at this. I can actually interact with it, right? Now, I'm going to do something, take this one step forward. If you remember about 10 minutes ago, I was talking about how Flutter is a rendering engine, right? And this rendering engine is on iOS right now. There's another one on Android that exists. Flutter is also working on a web rendering engine. So I can take the same code that I just ran on my iOS to write a native Flutter app, native iOS app. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go to Dartpad. And Dartpad is just a way to run Flutter code on the web for now. So I'm going to create, I'm going to paste in this code here, right? The same code. I haven't done anything, right? Same exact code. I'm going to hit run. And it's going to take a second because it's calling the server, it's uploading the code. But right when that's done, what do we see? We see the exact same app that I uploaded. Now, there's some slight issues because Flutter Web is still in alpha release. There's some slight issues, like the images are all the same, whatever. But for the most part, this is the exact same app with the exact same styling, with the exact same font and behavior, right? And running more or less at 60 frames per second. Because it's alpha, there's some issues that Flutter is working on. But this is the same app that I've deployed on 3 different devices now, right? And I can take this and I can actually build the same app for my Mac and for my Windows. So as long as the rendering engine exists in Flutter, I can run it anywhere I want. So I'm going to go back to my slides now, and let's do a recap, right? So let's see how Flutter, to give a recap, this is how Flutter apps are built, right? The architecture of a Flutter app. You have the framework that's written in Dart, and that's the material design widgets, that's the Cupertino widgets, which are basically very styled like a default iOS theme. And then below that, you have this idea of a widget. And a widget is, think of a widget as a Lego block. In Lego, the team behind Lego has worked really hard to make sure that the holes for the Lego pieces fit in any other hole. The edges or whatever they're called. I can't think of the word right now. So I can take any Lego piece and I can stick it together, right? And that's the beauty behind Lego. And that's why you can come up with like these very intricate designs in Lego, these tools. You can do the same in Dart. Every widget in Dart takes a child widget. And as long as it takes a widget, you can put these 2 widgets together. Now, sometimes you might not want to do that. Like you don't want to put a list view inside a button, but you know what? It's possible for you to do that, right? So this opens the playing field to build very, very complex, very beautiful, very unique looking applications, right? So that's what widgets are at a very high level. And then you have the rendering, which is just like, all the not pixel stuff. That's the C++. This is like the colors and all that crap. You have the animation layer, you have painting, you have gestures. So all this encompass the framework level of Flutter. Then you have the services layer. And what the services layer is like I was talking about before, if you want to talk to an iOS app or an Android app, some sensor that doesn't exist, some component that Flutter doesn't have, you can just make a call to the iOS world or Android world via a message bus, and both Android and iOS would receive that message, and you can go do your work. So, for example, a company reached out to me, and they said to me, "Hey, Faisal, can you take our iOS and Android app and rebuild it in Flutter?" And, oh yeah, by the way, you only have 3 months to do it. So I looked at it and I said, okay, fine, this is possible. And they said, are you sure? There is, years worth of business logic code that we have right now on Android and Kotlin. I mean, on Android and iOS and Kotlin and Swift. Can you rewrite that all in Dart? Now, I didn't tell them, but I just said, yeah, sure. Now, I'm not actually rewriting all this code. What I did was I kept all the business logic because they've written years of business logic already, right? And this might be the case for your app, your business, your company's app, your personal app. You already have a lot of business logic, right? Whether that's API calls, retrofit for Android, or all sorts of stuff that you're using already to make your app work. You don't want to get rid of all that because you don't want to rewrite all that right now. So what I did was I created a plugin for Flutter that interacted with both Android and iOS and talked to the business logic part of it, right? The UI layer I rebuilt entirely in Flutter, and whenever I needed access to any business logic code, I just called out to the Kotlin world and I called out to the Swift world and I said, hey, here's my inputs, give me the output for this. And what I was able to do was something that would have caused a lot of bugs because I didn't want to rewrite all the business logic. There's no bugs because the business logic has already been perfected with years of coding that these guys have done. And so step 2 now that the app is published, it's live, step 2 is me going back and rewriting this in business, rewriting all the business logic now. So the app is out, it's being tested, everything's great. Now I'll rewrite the business logic because we have more time now. And so whenever I rewrite a Flutter app, I always take this staggered approach of writing a plugin around the business logic world, building the UI, and then taking the business logic and rewriting in Flutter, rewriting it in Dart as a phase 2. So lots of cool stuff you can do with services. There's a lot of other services that exist, so we can talk about that after. Now, there's the shell world, which is, I think there's going to be a talk tomorrow about it, but Dart, at the end of the day, the VM and all that stuff is written in C++ and Skia using the Skia rendering engine. And so, to give performance. So if you're very interested in that, there's probably a talk about this. But if you go to flutter.dev, there's a talk from like 5 years ago about how the Flutter team built the Dart VM, the Skia rendering engine, and all that stuff that they got from Chrome and all that. So moving on, one code base, multiple platforms. I've been reading in the Slack who's using Flutter in production environments. The Flutter web isn't production ready yet. That's true. Flutter web is not production ready yet. I would not rewrite anything to Flutter web right now. However, when you're building your Flutter mobile app, I would start thinking about how to architect my mobile app so it can deal with multiple UI, right? This is actually a very important part. When you're architecting your Flutter app, it's very easy to kind of just like stick everything into one file, right? Because Flutter gives you this build function and you can write UI code there. But you got to think 2 steps ahead. And this is not a Flutter problem. This is a problem, not a problem. This is a computer science problem of how to architect code. And so as you're architecting your application, use some of the design patterns, model view controller, Redux, et cetera, so that you can say, if I'm running on mobile, then show this widget. If I'm running on web, show this widget. If I'm running on desktop, then show this other widget, right? That's how you should design your code. Right now, Flutter works exceptionally well on iOS and Android, 60 frames per second. I've run into no issues. I have multiple production apps. Some of them make a good amount of revenue, and that's because the app doesn't crash, and I have a business model behind it. But the users love the app, right? There's no issues, so I was able to get an app out really quickly on iOS and Android, and make money. So it's very possible to have production apps in Flutter. It's there's so many companies doing this right now. If you go to flutter.dev, you can actually see the companies that are building it, and it's eBay, it's Alibaba, it's a bunch of really big guys, and they've invested a lot of time and money into Flutter simply because they're able to get a consistent performance and build really high quality applications for both Android and iOS. So if you're an Android developer and you want to learn about Flutter, you can go to Flutter for Android developers. So I'm going to switch my screen, and I'm going to give you guys a run through for a couple things. So I'm going to go back to my screen right now, and I'm going to go to Flutter for Android developers, right? And so if you search up Flutter for Android developers, uh, a very smart person wrote Flutter for Android developers, and that smart person is me. I was asked by Google a couple of years ago, actually a year ago, to write this documentation. And what I did was I went through my entire Android history, right? And I said, what are the things that I always ask myself when I'm building a Flutter app about how did I do this in Flutter? How do I do this in Flutter that I did in Android? And so if you're an Android developer, you can go down and you can be like, what is the equivalent of a view in Flutter? How do I update widgets? Right? What is the equivalent of an intent in Flutter? Everything that you need to know how to build a Flutter app coming from an Android background, you will be able to do this. The same exists for iOS. If you're an iOS developer, another much more smarter person than I am wrote a Flutter app for iOS developers. Then someone wrote Flutter for React developers. And so someone had recently asked, what is the difference between React Native and Flutter, right? And here's the big difference. Both are equally good. If you want to be a React Native developer, go ahead, right? I have no issue with React Native, and I strongly believe that everyone should learn every framework, just so you understand that when you're building an application, which one you should use. So here's the big difference. Flutter has built a rendering engine that runs consistently on all devices, right? So whether you're running on iOS, on Android, or refrigerator, as long as our rendering engine looks and behaves, as long as a Flutter team built that rendering engine to spec, your application is going to look and behave the same way, right? I mean, there's obviously some caveats where, like, okay, the refrigerator doesn't have a GPS on it, but aside from that, it will look and behave the same. Now, React Native, on the other hand, is a bit different. When you write React Native code, there is a virtual V8 engine, a JavaScript engine that's running on your app. And as JavaScript comes through to that engine says, hey, am I on Android? Yes, I am. So because you requested a JavaScript button, a React button, I'm going to emit an Android native button. That's cool. On iOS, it looks great. On Android, what you will run into, and a lot of companies have reached out to me and told me, is that when they write React Native apps, they run into the same issue that they do when they build a native Android app, which is fragmentation. A lot of different Android devices look and behave differently, right? If you build your app and looks fine on a Pixel and like Samsung, it might not look fine on like a HTC that's being deployed in like the Philippines, right? In fact, a very popular company reached out to me with over 100 million installs of their app, right? Thinking about Flutter, and they said that we were burned by React Native because we had built a React Native app. We deployed it in the Philippines. It worked fine on our phones because we had, Samsung, Google. When we deployed in the Philippines, where a lot of our user base is, the app crashed and burned because users just had a really bad time because we could not test on those phones, right? Whereas they did a small test of Flutter, and they said, wow, the app just worked because the rendering engine, Google has a lot of resources. So Google is testing the rendering engine, the Flutter rendering engine, on a wide range of devices, right? Think about how much money Google has, and think about all the devices they can buy, right? They can always buy more devices than you. And so they're testing the Flutter rendering engine on every single device that probably exists on Earth. And so they know of all the issues, and they're fixing those issues. And so when you deploy your app, it doesn't matter which phone it's running on, your app will look and behave the same. So that's the big difference there, right? I'm going to go back to my slides. And so one question that I get asked is, does Flutter support X, native integrations and stuff? Like I talked about, you can build plugins. And there's actually a great package manager called pub.dev, right? I'm going to switch back one more time to my desktop. I apologize for that. So if you go to pub.dev, pub.dev is basically if you're a Node.js developer, it's the NPM of the Dart world, right? It's just a package repository that has all the plugins that exist for Flutter. So, you might ask me, Faisal, does Flutter support GPS? Technically, out of the box, Flutter does not. However, the Flutter team went and wrote a plugin for GPS, right? And so now I can basically I can add this plugin to my Flutter project. I can import this package, and I can say check for connectivity. Oh, this is a connection plugin, not GPS. My bad. I can check if I'm on mobile or Wi-Fi, right? If I want GPS, I can search GPS here. I can get the geolocator plugin, and I can say, all right, let's install the geolocator plugin and basically get my current GPS position. Now, when the app runs on iOS, it's going to make a call out to the iOS code that this person wrote, and the code's going to say, hey, okay, this person wants the current position. Hey, Swift, call your current position code and give me the results, and I'm going to pass it back to Flutter. And that's how it works, right? So anything you can think of, most likely it exists now because it's 2020. There's been a lot of plugins that have been developed for Flutter. And so if this was 2 years ago, I would say sometimes you won't find something, but these days you'll find absolutely anything, right? For example, if I want a plugin to do video, Google Maps, for example, right? I can say Google Maps, I'm gonna type in type in Google Maps, and I'm gonna get a plugin here. I'm going to copy and paste this, and now I get Google Maps support, right? So pub.dev is your friend. Use it all the time. You'll find a wide range of plugins there, and you'll be able to build really rich, powerful applications using Flutter. So going back to my slides, so finish this off. I'm not going to show the eBay demo, but basically if you go to Play Store, you can search for eBay Motors, and that is a Flutter app written by eBay. And so you can actually use it. And if I were to just not tell you this was a Flutter app, you would not know, right? You would think, oh, okay, this is just a nice looking Android app, or this is a nice looking iOS app, and you would use it. If you're one of the few unfortunate people that installed Stadia, the Stadia app is also written in Flutter. Now, Stadia is a terrible game system, but the app is beautiful, right? And if you use the app, you'll see that it's beautiful, the way the animations are, the way the imagery is of the games. It makes you want to wish that Stadia was a better game system. So with that, I'm going to take some Q&A. I think a couple people asked, a couple people are laughing about Stadia, but a couple people asked a couple of questions. So I'm just going to go to the slides. I'm going to Twitch channel and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, cool. So, all right, there's 4 questions here that I'm going to answer. The first question is, what kind of major Flutter announcements can we expect in the nearest future? Now, I don't know anything about what's happening internally in the Flutter team. I wish I did, but I know enough from, you'll see a new Flutter release, obviously. You won't see Flutter 2.0. I don't think so. I think they're probably by next year you'll see 2.0, but that's just a guess. But what you will see is a beta version of Flutter Web, right? And maybe a beta version of Flutter for desktop, because the Flutter team is really hard at work at it. So they're working hard on it, and we'll probably see an announcement soon. Regarding Fuchsia, which I know everyone wants to hear about, Fuchsia is so far still experimental. It's going into production, but not many people know with what. My theory personally is that Fuchsia is going to be for the IoT devices that have a screen, right? So currently, if you have a Lenovo Google Assistant watch, clock, or a Google Home Assistant screen called the Home Hub, the UI there is Flutter, right? So maybe Fuchsia is just going to replace the OS running on these devices. I don't know. That's just a guess. So the other question is, how much of the code can realistically be shared between Flutter Mobile and Flutter Web? All your UI code can be shared, 100%. There are plugins that are being worked on that you will be able to share. For example, a Flutter, um, what is it? Flutter Web? No, Flutter Desktop. I'm not sure which plugin was it. There's a plugin that Firebase Web, obviously. Yeah. So Firebase database and all the Firebase suite of plugins are being written so that they can support desktop, mobile, and web, right? So realistically, say in 2 years or a year, you should be able to realistically share 85% of the code, right? There's going to be some code that you can't share, right? You can't share the contact picker code. You can't share like the screen display code or whatever, like to detect if the screen is on or off. But most of the code you will be able to share as long as you architect your application correctly. Another question is, what adjustments are required in working Flutter mobile app to support web as well? Like I said, architect your code. So there is a package, not a package, a library that's built into Flutter called platform. So you can say if platform.isIOS, then display this code. So what you can do is you can say if platform.isIOS or Android, then display a list view. However, if I am running on web, then display two list views side by side, right? Because I have a bigger screen. And so you can kind of play around with this. You can also use media queries. And so media queries, just like CSS media queries, where you can say, if the width of my device is 400 pixels, then show this widget. If the width of my device is 1,000 pixels, then most likely I'm running on desktop. So show two widgets together, right? And so that way you get a responsive application. And I think tomorrow or the day after, there's a talk on responsive applications. So just look at that, go to that talk, and you'll basically learn how to build a Flutter web app. Does Flutter offer a backend? Flutter is the framework that is written in Dart to run mobile. So you can use Dart on the backend. I have. The unfortunate thing is there's not a lot of active development from the community. However, if you want a simple backend, you can use it, right? Personally, though, if I was me, I would just use Cloud Functions and just write my applications and deploy it on functions, and then get Flutter, use the Cloud Functions package, and just communicate with my functions that way. Could Flutter support watchOS in the near future? Yes, they are talking about it in a GitHub issue. I don't know much about watchOS to know how it works, but there is some discussion about it. I'm a new person to Flutter. Where should I start? I know the C language. You know what? Go to flutter.dev. The flutter.dev is a great resource. Watch this talk if you just joined. There's a bunch of other talks online. But flutter.dev is the best resource to learn Dart. If you know C, most likely you know Dart. You understand concepts. You know how to do loops. You know how to do if statements. You know how to do, basic programming. So Dart is a very simple language to learn. Best state management approach I would recommend. I've used Block a lot. Block works for me. There's a discussion. Someone was talking about Redux along with a language library called Get-It that I want to investigate. That's one of those places that the Flutter team has basically said, we recommend Block, but the community recommends a bunch of other different design patterns. So kind of use a lot of them and see which one works for you. There's no real right answer. It really depends on your use case. Block always seems to work for me, so I just kind of use it. What are some of the limitations in using Flutter against native iOS or Android? For the developed world, I guess, where you have iOS X, Pixels, North America market, European market, there's no real limitation, right? You're not going to be bound by any limitation. The limitations come when you're developing for the developing markets, the emerging markets, where device memory footprint is low. You're better off developing Android One or progressive web apps there, simply because those devices are already extremely slow. Yeah, sure, Flutter might work on them, but you might not get the best performance, right? So focus on progressive web apps for those countries, for those markets. Um, is there any value for native development now that Flutter exists? Well, native development is not going anywhere. Android and iOS will always stick around. So if you're looking for a job, basically, like 2 months from now, then learn native Android or native iOS. Chances of you getting a job there are much higher. If you're looking for a job 6 months from now, a year from now, learn Flutter, right? Because more and more you see a lot more jobs popping up on job boards that companies are looking for Flutter developers. So it depends on your use case. I would always suggest you learn a bit of Android and iOS just so you conceptually understand how those platforms work. Like I know iOS probably, 20, 30%. I can like work my way around it. Android, I've been doing it for a while, so I'm like close to 90%. I know Android. But, they're still useful for me to know. Just because if I run into any issues, if I want to write a plugin, then it's always good to know Swift. It's always good to know Kotlin. Is there a way to integrate native ads? Yes, there is. I just did that last week. It's basically a widget. Just search on Pub for AdMob or Flutter or Facebook Ad Network, and you can integrate it. There is a plugin. I did it last night. I talked about my favorite state management technique, which is block. Can you name well-known applications that were made using Flutter? Well, the eBay Motors app, the Hamilton app. If you go to Flutter.dev, at the bottom it says who is using Flutter. The Google Ads app, if you download Google Ads on your phone, that's using Flutter. Realtor.com uses Flutter. Baidu uses Flutter. So pretty big apps. And you can find all those apps online. Can we program Apple Watch? I already spoke about that. Which backend works really well with Flutter? I use Node.js a lot on the backend, TypeScript. And so I deploy it to Cloud Functions. There's a Cloud Functions library that I can use with Flutter that instead of making HTTP calls, it makes RPC calls. And so that makes life a whole lot easier for me. So that's what I use. Are you interested in joining GDG online events? Yes, I am interested. Just like send me a Twitter. Is Flutter Web supposed to replace Angular? I think so. A long time ago, someone at Google, I'm not going to mention their name, told me that one day they're thinking about merging Angular and Flutter together. And when I heard of that, this was like 5 years ago. When I heard of that, I was like, wow, that's pretty weird. And now it all makes sense, right? Now with Flutter Web, it all makes sense. So I do think that Angular will go away. This is no official confirmation because I have not been told by anyone that Angular is going away. I just think from a pure business standpoint, Angular will go away. I'm a Java developer. What's the difference between Dart and Java? There's a big differences, doesn't use the Java VM, Dart VM and stuff. Language-wise, it's very similar. It's less verbose, right? If you know Java, you know Dart already, right? Except that you don't have to type everything because Dart is optionally typed. A good place to go to is dartbyexample.com, and you'll learn Dart very easily. Can I develop 2D games using Flutter? Yes, you can. What are your thoughts on Provider? I've used Block, and I've used providers with Block, unless I'm missing the terminology. I think it's fine. It's great. Yes, last question. Okay. Could you share more on security for apps using Flutter? So Flutter has an experimental obfuscation thing. If you search up Flutter obfuscate, you can do that. Other than that, the security principles, look at mobile security base in general, right? The same principles apply. Don't embed shared keys, all that stuff. So just look at how Android and iOS have done it. The beauty about it is conceptually, you can look at how Android and iOS solve problems and basically solve the same problems here. So with that, if you have more questions, just send me a tweet to @Faisal Abid. You can also email me at faisalabid@gmail.com. And just, I hope this talk was useful. It's kind of a different talk for me because I don't get interaction well. So I hope this was useful for you, and thank you for attending.